Adam Mahoney is a climate and environmental reporter for Capital B News and joins me now. Hey, Adam, thanks so much for being here.
Hey there, thanks for having me.
So, Adam, what is the most important thing people should know about how race is contextualizing what's happening in Venezuela right now?
Race is impacting the situation in Venezuela, both in Venezuela and in the United States. At Capital B, we've been doing a bit of reporting focused on the Afro Venezuelan population. And actually, among Latin America's Spanish speaking countries, Venezuela is home to the highest share of citizens with African ancestry. And obviously, as we know, race shapes how you live your life and also view the government and the state. Speaking to Afro Venezuelans in the country, we also found out that it impacts how they view Maduro and the government there. And in terms of, historically, Afro Venezuelans were not seen or respected by the government. But in the last 25 years, there has been a shift in terms of support and resources being sent to Afro Venezuelan communities, which in turn has kind of led to a semblance of sympathy for the government, and which is why a lot of folks in the country have come out staunchly against U.S. intervention. And at the same time, in the United States, we're seeing that race is shaping how this intervention will impact U.S. citizens. So we did a story about the oil crisis, right? And Trump's push to control oil in Venezuela and ultimately one day bring that oil onto U.S. shores to be refined here, where the very thick special type of crude that is found in Venezuela would best be refined is actually in Black communities in the United States along the Gulf South, where the world's largest concentration of oil refineries are found. So we're seeing an uptick in fears around environmental racism and the impact of pollution that will be had on these communities because of an increase in oil refinery.
And would you say that Americans and Western media specifically, how are we shaping the view of Maduro, keeping our own racial biases in mind?
To that point, obviously race does not look the same everywhere, but I think the general consensus of a Latin American country, a Spanish speaking country, typically does, from the US perspective, we think that, Black people don't exist in these places. And a lot of that does have to do with historically, in the aftermath of the abolition of slavery, people did stop identifying with their African ancestry. Venezuela is really unique in that regard. And it's actually something that's relatively new in terms of people identifying with that African ancestry. And as I was talking to both, historians and advocates in Venezuela, that they made the point that just like in the United States, you might not see the disenfranchised, the Black and brown people of this country as like the quote unquote enemy. It's the same in terms of, and in Venezuela, those are the most disenfranchised and the people that have the most to lose based off of, U.S. intervention or just a lack of resources getting sent to their communities.
And Maduro and before him, Hugo Chavez, both have roots in these Afro-Indigenous working class communities. And so how is that shaping the support they may have domestically, but the hostility that is being perceived internationally?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so speaking to Afro Venezuelans again, I mean, Hugo Chavez, the support there was extremely high, right? And I spoke to both historians and academics in the country and also Afro Venezuelan historians in the United States who said, prior to the economic collapse of the mid 2010s, it would be really, really difficult to find an Afro Venezuelan who did not support the government. That has obviously shifted a bit over the last decade in terms of, obviously there's been a lack of access to food and jobs, partially a result of Maduro's mismanagement in addition to U.S. economic sanctions. So today it is a little bit more muddy in terms of support for the government. But overall, there is a relationship between Afro-Venezuelan communities and the government in a way that we don't necessarily see in the United States. There is a consensus of a need to support communities that are disenfranchised there, even if it's not always reaching them, where we see in the United States, obviously, there's been a lot of attacks and rollbacks on things like civil rights and economic support for disenfranchised communities.
And what role did the Bolivarian movement play in reshaping life for Afro Venezuelans?
Yeah, I mean, that was really the first time that the Afro-Venezuelan identity was acknowledged, and it was not easy. Hugo Chavez was the first president to say that he was, a product of slavery and had African ancestry, but that was the result of activists and advocates pushing him for a couple of years to get to that point. But after that, we did see specific programs related to, access to healthcare, access to food, and even recognition within like government representation skyrocket after Hugo Chavez took office. But once again, some of those things have been rolled back under the Maduro government. So that relationship is in a more rocky space. But based off of my conversations with Afro Venezuelans, everyone I spoke to, about a half a dozen people, were anti-U.S. intervention and generally sympathetic for the attempts of the current government, although they all acknowledge that what is written on paper does not always actually reach these communities.
Now, you mentioned, of course, that Afro Venezuelans stand to lose the most as a result of oil infrastructure being targeted with this latest intervention. Why is that, and what exactly could that look like?
Yeah, so when Hugo Chavez decided to kind of regain control over the oil industry in the country, part of that was to push the profits from the oil industry into um, communities of African descent and communities that were facing the most kind of economic devastation historically. So once the country did regain control, that is when we did see the shift economically in terms of resources reaching these places. But as the country stopped exporting out so much of their oil, those profits did shrink pretty exponentially. But if the country, again, under the U.S. control and under the control of American oil companies, does begin to ramp up oil production again, it is highly unlikely that any of those profits would trickle down to Afro Venezuelans or to the poor and impoverished communities of Venezuela, particularly as the Trump administration has made it a point to say that he does want a big share of that oil to come to the United States, and he is calling on American companies to kind of lead that process.
And you have made direct links in your reporting from what is happening in Venezuela with the oil refineries to what happens in the Gulf region of the United States and with oil production there. And how could this be exacerbated given that we know Black people in those areas are already suffering high asthma rates, high cancer rates disproportionately, right? And how could that be exacerbated if we have a new source of oil coming in?
Yeah. So, I live in Louisiana and New Orleans, and there's this stretch of land between New Orleans and Baton Rouge known as Cancer Alley. It's a 85-mile stretch where there's over 200 petrochemical facilities. And to your point, it is a community or a region that is over 40% Black, and Black folks there have been living on the front lines of kind of this environmental and climate impact because of oil refining. At one point, Venezuelan oil was a larger share of the oil being refined in the United States, particularly in the Gulf South, because the refineries that are built here from Houston to New Orleans were actually built and mined to refine the thicker crude that comes from Venezuela. But at the same time, that thicker crude does require a different refining process that is actually, 30 to 40% worse for the climate and the environment. So speaking to advocates and including, former refinery workers, there's a fear that if there is once again kind of an exponential increase in the refining of Venezuelan oil, that will lead to worse health effects for the communities that live next to these facilities.
And what do you hear from people in both places about how they understand the way that these environmental impacts affect them?
Just speaking from the U.S. context, I spoke to an advocate, John Beard, who lives in Port Arthur, Texas, in Southeast Texas, where one of the five largest oil refineries in the world is located, and would be set to receive some of this Venezuelan oil. Mr. Beard used to, work actually at the refinery for over 30 years until he himself kind of had a place to be introspective and understand how it was impacting not only his health, but his community's health. He said, growing up, he went to more funerals than he can count for people who, died of cancer. And in his community, the average person there, 1 out of 50 people is expected to have a cancer case as the result of air pollution in that community, which is 190 times higher than the US EPA's like allowable limit. So these impacts are felt, daily and also generationally.
Do you get the sense that Afro Venezuelans have the same kind of awareness of their vulnerability in terms of their proximity to oil extraction?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's actually something that did not come up in my reporting, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, over the last 20 years or so, because of that decline in oil production, the both the environmental impacts and maybe the economic impacts of refining have not been as in your face as they were, in generations past. But if the United States or if American oil companies were to come in and build that infrastructure, what we have seen historically, not just in the context of the United States, but across the globe, is that infrastructure is most often placed in communities that don't really have the ability to kind of bear the harm caused by them.
But, overall, it does seem like there is a takeaway here, for Black Americans and for Afro Venezuelans to understand that these geopolitical issues affect us in our everyday lives. Even when things seem so far away, they can have really direct trickle-down effects.
Yeah, no, exactly that. I mean, I could clearly say based off of, speaking to Venezuelans in the country and then even, Black American activists here, both sets of interviews, people did make those connections and the understanding of how race and, anti-Black racism kind of impacts the life outcomes and abilities of folks from the United States to Venezuela and everywhere in between. And it's kind of hard not to see that, right? If you're living in those constant negative impacts of government and state level actions.
Let me ask you, I mean, given obviously we have seen really high immigration enforcement activity here in the US just the same at the very same time that this intervention is happening in Venezuela. What are some of the consequences that you'll be kind of keeping an eye out for or things that given what we've discussed we should be mindful of in the months ahead?
Yeah, I think in terms of, Venezuelan migrants in the United States, one of the things that came up in interviews with researchers here in the country is just understanding what kind of migrant would be targeted in the US. And that would, as we have seen under the Trump administration, has leaned to the blacker you are, the more likely you would be targeted. And I think there's an interesting dynamic playing out here in the U.S. in terms of migration. Speaking to researchers, there was a first wave of Venezuelan migration that actually predated the revolution of the early 2000s, and that was much like that we saw in Cuba. It was a whiter, wealthier population that first came to the United States, kind of escaping what they saw as the economic turmoil of a more socialist government. And those people did settle in Florida, and they are the folks that we saw protesting or celebrating the U.S. intervention in the country. So there is this kind of racial dynamic that is also going to play out in the United States in terms of between Venezuelan migrant communities, something that has kind of been hidden for a while, researchers said, but they imagine, with so much focus and attention on the country will kind of be, thrust into the mainstream.
Well, we, along with you, Adam, will be keeping an eye out for that. That is Adam Mahoney, who is a climate and environmental reporter for Capital B News. Thank you so very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe below and click the playlist button for more Rooted videos. And a big thank you to our sponsor, Brightbound, for supporting this conversation. Brightbound is reimagining career readiness, helping middle and high school students explore their passions, try out career paths, and make confident decisions about their future.